Hello and welcome back to this Dem for the Dualistic Crusade. This video is one I wanted to put together because the Frist Art Museum is doing another exhibition that I thought would make for a really great supplemental film series. So they have a new exhibit opening entitled Knights in Armor, which is all various pieces of arms and armament from the medieval and Renaissance periods and beyond from the Museo Stibert in Italy. So, of course, anytime you think of medieval films, there's so many great films set in the medieval periods or the periods of the Renaissance, and just even thinking of arms and armament and knights on horseback and jousting tournaments, you get all those romantic visions in your head. But there are really great films that give you a wonderful sense of what it would have been like to exist in that time period. And of course, frequently dramatized and made much more romantic than the actual reality of being in said time and place, which was, of course, quite miserable. So I wanted to put together a little program of titles that I thought were important, and I tried to specifically focus on films that were of the correct historical periods and gave you a great sense of costumes and production design, and tried to, again, focus on titles that really gave you a sense of the arms and armament, and in both a realistic sense and a highly detailed sense. Since this theme and this time period it gives you so many choices to choose from, I had to definitely narrow it down somehow. So I tried to focus on titles that were both well-known and lesser known, and also jumping into a few different genres a little bit to show the vastness of medieval films that are out there, and also other titles that are not necessarily as well known, and are, unfortunately, some on this list are a little bit harder to get a good copy of simply due to their video status and preservation status, but they are nonetheless extraordinarily important. So to start this list, I of course have to go to the silent era, and there are a great number of films that are wonderful period films from the silent era, but there is one that really towers above the rest. It is one of the great masterworks of the silent era, as of course 1922's Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood, one of the two great Robin Hood films. And if it weren't for the most famous film that we'll talk about in a little bit, this would be the great Robin Hood film of them all. As it is, it stands shoulder to shoulder with its more famous counterpart. This is one of the epics of the silent film genre. It broke records in its set construction, its massive budget, and of course was a super production of the legendary star Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who has to be seen to be believed if you've never seen a Fairbanks picture before from his action swashbuckler days. He truly was the first action star, and still his legendary star turns are unparalleled in his sheer presence on screen. What's even more astounding about this version of Robin Hood is that it does actually start in the Crusades, which not every version does, and it gives you the whole story, and you get incredible production design for the time, and most particularly the main castle set was so large that you could actually see it in the then growing Los Angeles from miles away. It is an epic. It is a true epic of the silent period, and unfortunately it has not been talked about, and to be quite honest, the Fairbanks films are not as lauded as they should be. They are absolute legends, and they should be shown as at any given opportunity. Fortunately, there are a handful of decent video releases, but they are not always easy to find. As it stands today, the best video release of the Douglas Fairbanks Robin Hood is still the old Kino DVD from the early 2000s, which unfortunately is out of print, but you can find it still. There were a couple of VHS and Laserdisc releases, and unfortunately there's a whole flood of terrible public domain versions, so I do encourage you to avoid those, but see the film in any way possible. It is a true epic of the silent period. It is still one of the great adventure films, and as I said, it is without question one of the two Robin Hood films that are absolute masterpieces and are so timeless, magical artistic triumphs that you really shouldn't bother trying to make another Robin Hood film because it's already been perfected twice. But the first is, of course, Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood from 1922. Now, there are many other Fairbanks films that were period adventure films. It became a whole genre that Fairbanks really pioneered, and you could stretch that all the way to the original version of The Thief of Baghdad. But it's also great to look at his other star turns in these historical adventure films, like his version of The Three Musketeers from 1921. He also was in a version of The Man in the Iron Mask later on in his career, and he did many other period adventure films. But for this particular topic and its unbelievable scale, Douglas Fairbanks in Robin Hood, which is the actual title to separate it from all of the imitators, that is the one. And the production design alone in the silent era, it is an incredible triumph, and it's truly a great film. It is a film you could introduce people to silent films with. It still plays beautifully. So, of course, next would be 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood, directed by Michael Curtiz and William Keighley, starring the immortal Errol Flynn in his most famous role. This is the great Robin Hood film. Everything other than the Fairbanks original silent epic are pale imitations. This is one of the most classic films in the Warner Brothers library, one of the most beautiful Technicolor films ever shot. It is an absolute legend. It is one of the most triumphantly perfected Hollywood productions that has ever been released. If you have never seen this film, what in the world are you doing with your life? And anytime you can reference Adventures of Robin Hood, you should do so. And of course, the production design is legendary. So this is absolutely perfect for this topic, and everything is photographed in heart-stoppingly beautiful Technicolor. It is, for me, this is what I think is the pinnacle of three-strip Technicolor in the three-strip process. This is when everything had been perfected, and I don't think there is a greater example of the beauty of three-strip Technicolor than The Adventures of Robin Hood, one of the most immortal films to ever come out of a Hollywood studio, and one of the absolute triumphant masterpieces of the cinema that will brighten even the darkest of days. So, of course, I have the Criterion CAV Anniversary Laserdisc, which is still, I think, the best sonic presentation of the film's original mono audio track. But, of course, the Blu-ray is essential for Warner's restoration efforts, even though this is really getting up there in age. It was one of their first Blu-rays. This was actually the first Blu-ray I ever purchased back when the format was new, and imports over some lovely extras from the DVD releases, but the audio is not as good as the Criterion Laserdisc. There is talk that Warner is going to be working on a 4K restoration and UHD release in the near future, which hopefully does happen, because that is going to be a truly landmark release on the UHD format, and this is one of Warner's crown jewels, so hopefully that happens sooner rather than later. Now, there are many other great classic films that deal with grand armies and in full armor and battles, and of course historical period films. These run the gamut from Warner's excellent Technicolor, The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, the court drama of the love story between Queen Elizabeth and the Earl of Essex, again, of course, played by Errol Flynn and directed by Michael Curtiz. That has some incredible production values in Technicolor, but the actual armor on display is much more serving the story. It is simply part of the incredible production value. You could and should also talk about Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 masterpiece, Alexander Nevsky, but that film unfortunately does not have any great releases past the old out-of-print Criterion DVD, and is also dealing with a different type of armor, since it is about an entirely different theater of war and conflict. but it's still, and as with anything Eisenstein ever did, it goes without saying, it's still an unbelievable experience and should be seen. But unfortunately, the old, very expensive Criterion DVD is the only good official release out there at this time. I think there are some Blu-rays floating around in Europe, but I'm not sure what source they might be mastered from. But again, that's getting into slightly different terms of what part of the world you're talking about in terms of the armor and the part of history that's being depicted. But still, the armor in that film is quite impressive. Of course, Hollywood would also continue making films based on the tales of Dumas. So we had other versions of The Man in the Iron Mask, and also a later wonderful Technicolor version of The Three Musketeers in 1948. But another film that doesn't get talked about a lot, but also has wonderful horror connotations, and many of the great classic horror stars, was made at Universal in 1939 in the golden year of Hollywood, and itself is a classic. That is, of course, Tower of London, directed by Roland V. Lee, which I have here in the old Boris Karloff DVD set. It has been released by Shot Factory in some of their Universal Horror Blu-ray volumes, but it's not really a horror film. It's essentially Universal doing a version of Richard III, and wonderfully played here by Basil Rathbone, and his machinations to take over the throne by essentially killing off everyone in line of succession. And it's a beautifully mounted film. It has incredible production values for Universal at the time, and most famously has Boris Karloff as the bald, looming head executioner, frequently leering over his axe sharpening when he's getting ready to behead the next victim to be put into the Tower of London by the devilishly evil Richard. And of course, it is also doing bits of the classic Shakespeare stories. So you have the drowning in the vat of wine, and it's also a must-watch for horror fans because Vincent Price is the third lead in the film, and it is an incredibly well-mounted film. In fact, it was so well done that pieces of its battle footage was actually reused decades later for the film of the same title made by Roger Corman in the 1960s, also with Vincent Price. But it's incredibly well done, and it's a must for horror fans. So it's one of the rare films of this sort of genre that sort of tiptoes in the horror realm. So it's a wonderful experience and a great classic from Universal in the golden age of Hollywood. Of course, if you want more of a Spanish influence to the armor on display, this next film gives you a perfect example of both more English-style armor and costuming of the time period, and also the Spanish armor and costuming of the time period. The production design of this film is incredible because it was mounted with the full force of Warner Brothers at their production peak behind it. And if I can ever work in another adventure, timeless classic starring Errol Flynn, well, you better bet I'm going to. So, of course, that's 1940's The Seahawk, one of the all-time great adventure films, again directed by the legend Michael Curtiz, with an incredible Eric Wolfgang Korngold score. This is one of the most handsomely mounted adventure films ever made, with incredible production design, and again giving you a really interesting look at both the English and Spanish forces, as Flynn's character is essentially forced to take on the entirety of the Spanish Armada. Again, this is one of the great adventure films, beautifully photographed in black and white, with some sequences finally restored in the original sepia tone and the island sequences. So this is an incredible film and has not dated at all. It builds to an incredible climax with one of the screen's great sword fights, and very much goes hand in hand with the other tried and true Flynn starring adventure classics, starting with 1935's Captain Blood, going on to 1936's Charge of the Light Brigade, 1938's Adventures of Robin Hood. You could also throw in Prince and the Pauper and so many others, but this is one of the other absolute Flynn starring adventure classics. And again, the production design is stunning. This is the beautiful Warner Archive Blu-ray from a brand new scan they put out a couple years ago. It is a must-own title. This is one of the timeless films you can return to again and again, and you should. It's a beautiful Blu-ray. This is the way you want to see this film, and it does have a handful of nice extras, as the archive frequently does, but I couldn't resist working this in because it does give you more of that Spanish influence, because you get to see the costuming of the Spanish forces and the contrast between the Spanish style of armor and the more European appearing and English style of armor. Continuing the idea of talking about Shakespeare films as well, I think you would be remiss if you didn't talk about the three epic Shakespeare productions produced and made by Laurence Olivier. So of course we're talking about 1944's Henry V, 1948's Hamlet, shot in black and white, and 1955's Richard III. All three are legendary in the annals of Shakespeare adaptations. They still rank as some of, if not quite possibly, the best Shakespeare films ever made, and they have incredible production design that each are differentiated for each of the three films, so they each have a unique look. Here I have the lovely Criterion Laserdisc of Henry V with this really interesting cover they did. The films have since gotten spiffed up DVD releases, and there are some Blu-rays available as well. It would be really interesting to see all four of them get the full 4K treatment and perhaps be released together as a set, but these are still incredible to look at for their production design, particularly at this time period in the 40s and 50s. Now, also talking about Shakespeare adaptations with really incredible production design, this one is even more remarkable because it did not have the greatest budget in the world, and it was made at Republic Studios, primarily known for westerns and their cliffhanger adventure serials. And that, of course, is Orson Welles' 1948 version of Macbeth, which is still one of the great Shakespeare films, just as his version of Othello is, even with the baked-in compromises of how he had to make these films. So, of course, his version of Macbeth had an original release that was longer and had an attempt to try and have authentic, really more of an authentic Scottish burr in the dialogue, which didn't really sit well with a lot of people. So unfortunately, it was recut and had a new sound mix made with more quote-unquote normal-sounding voices. But still, in any version, the visuals, the production design, and even the armor is really impressive, especially when you have to consider the fact that this film was made at Republic on a rather low budget. And, you know, if you look close enough, sometimes you can spot some of those seams, but it doesn't detract from the astounding performances and the impact of this film. This is still, I think, easily the best visual representation of Shakespeare's classic play. I don't think anything has ever come close, although there are some pretty solid versions later on, like the Polanski version of Macbeth. But this for me is still the definitive visual representation of Macbeth, combined with Welles's incredible adaptation skills. This is the beautiful olive signature release from a new scan. It's a 2-disc release with both cuts of the film, so you can experience both cuts and, most importantly, both audio presentations. It's got some really fantastic new extras and a new commentary, and is one of their nice deluxe signature presentations. So the slipcase comes off and you get a nice 2-disc presentation with this wonderful booklet. So this is definitely the way you want to see Welles's classic version of Macbeth, which has, like his version of Othello, has not gotten as many accolades as it really deserves, and is even more impressive and amazing considering the incredible difficulties he had in even making this film. Next, we move on to a sort of unofficial trilogy, since they share the same producer, studio, director, and mostly the same cinematographer and composer, and the same lead star. That starts with one of the great adventure films and one of the most beautiful Technicolor films ever shot, 1952's Ivanhoe, made by MGM, produced in England, starring Robert Taylor, and based, of course, on Sir Walter Scott's classic novel, one of the great adventure stories of all time. This is still the best version of Ivanhoe. It has production values like you wouldn't believe, and it truly gets across the sense sense of pageantry that existed in this time period, and it is done on such a scale and with such incredible color photography by Freddie Young, one of the great cinematographers who ever lived. It is a visual feast for the eyes. This is the new Warner Archive Blu-ray done from a new scan. This is one of the most beautiful looking Blu-rays that you can purchase today. It's one of the most beautiful color films ever shot. It shows the more subtle British use of Technicolor. Most British produced films were not as vivid necessarily as American Technicolor films, but they showed off a more subtle and intricate use of the palette. Things like what you see in the classic Archer's films, like Black Narcissus, for example. That's part of why Ivanhoe has really stood the test of time. It's backed by an incredible score, and again, the attention to detail in the production design, the costuming, the armor. I think this probably has one of, if not the best, jousting tournament sequence you'll ever see in a film. It is incredibly well realized, and it builds to an epic action climax with an entire army assault on a castle. It is an incredibly beautiful film in terms of its photography, and that alone makes it worth your time. But in terms of the production design and detail, and again, just the sense of pageantry. In short, this is simply put one of the most incredible films to ever deal with knights in armor. In terms of its production design, its visuals, and giving you the sense of the pageantry of the time period, and just incredibly visually beautiful. Again, I think this is one of the most gorgeous color films ever shot, and again, showing you the incredible power of what the Technicolor process could do, and of course, this being in the 1950s in England, so showing you the key differences from what 50s English Technicolor films could look like. And of course, it has the full financing and backing of an American studio in terms of production value and stars. This is just one of the key films to ever deal with knights in armor, and was so ridiculously successful that it spawned 2 additional films with the same major cast and crew players to sort of form this unofficial trilogy. So again, this is the Warner Archive Blu-ray. It is a wonderful Blu-ray. However, I do still think the already impressive Laserdisc does have slightly better audio. And of course, it has this incredibly beautiful cover. This was their first attempt at restoring the original Technicolor source. It has been supplanted by this incredible Must-Own Blu-ray release. But again, I do think the audio is just the slightest bit better on the Laserdisc presentation. Next comes the sort of second film in this unofficial trilogy, and this is actually the most important one for what it did for every film that came afterwards that dealt with knights and armor or everything. That is 1953's Knights of the Round Table, with the same major cast and crew players. This is actually in CinemaScope, though. It was MGM's first CinemaScope film, still shot in England, and beautiful color by the legendary Freddie Young. This is an incredibly handsome and well-mounted film telling you the story of Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It is really the foundation for every film about King Arthur that has come afterwards. It has the pageantry and spectacle of Ivanhoe, but of course this time in widescreen and with a greater focus on the romance with the Guinevere character and Lancelot, for example. This has also, since it's CinemaScope, it has a 4-track magnetic stereo soundtrack, which has been replicated here on the old Laserdisc release. This has an incredibly gorgeous Miklos Rozsa score, which is well known and highly regarded in film score circles in terms of soundtrack fans. So it is worth it for the visuals and the score alone, but it still ranks as one of the best and most classic films to deal with King Arthur. This was also hugely influential on a certain troupe later on. When you see this, you will recognize this is one of the films that heavily influenced the Monty Python members when they were setting up Holy Grail. So this definitely is the film where you have the very archaic sword fights with the heavy broadswords, and the knights are in armor and they can barely move, and it looks a little comical, but it is actually rather accurate in that sense, and is very much the inspiration for the fights you see in Holy Grail. Now, this is the old MGM UA Laserdisc, which does replicate the 4-track mag stereo mix and Dolby Surround. And then they did a DVD of this master when Warner Brothers released a DVD. But unfortunately, that's the only ways you can see the film on video. There is no Blu-ray as of yet. So I'm hoping the Warner Archive, since they did Ivanhoe, decide to release the new Blu-ray with a new scan and transfer of this film, because it would really knock your socks off. But it's still a beautiful film. Again, it is very early CinemaScope. This is 1953, so it's MGM's first scope film. So it does have some of the early scope issues in terms of everyone trying to learn how to use the anamorphic lenses, and they being the early style of anamorphic lenses. But you also get the benefit of it getting a 4-track magnetic stereo mix, which really allows the music to soar. So again, this is still a very beautiful, extremely well mounted film that is really quite probably still the most solid and the best film dealing with King Arthur. And again, it influenced every film that came afterwards that ever had knights and a round table. Now, the third and final film in this sort of unofficial trilogy is 1955's The Adventures of Quentin Durward. Again, same cast and principal crew, again shot at CinemaScope in England, but it didn't really have a great critical reception and didn't have the major box office takings of the first two films, so it was just sort of forgotten about, unfortunately. It has been released on DVD by the Warner Archive as part of their MOD program, so it is available, but you will have to custom order it online. Unfortunately, it's not a new transfer, so again, it would be great if the Warner Archive did a new scan and Blu-ray release of that film, so you could finally have all three films on nice, beautiful new Blu-ray releases, because they really and truly deserve it. And then because other studios saw the success MGM was having with their historical adventure films and their medieval films, 20th Century Fox decided to try their own attempt with 1954's Prince Valiant, which is a really wonderful historical adventure film set in Arthurian times. It doesn't get talked about as much, but it's still a wonderful amount of fun. Also shot in CinemaScope with a great Franz Waxman score. This was directed by the great Henry Hathaway with a phenomenal cast. This is the Eureka British Blu-ray, which is still the best video release currently available. There is no major American release with some nice art inside. It's pretty much just film only. There are unfortunately no extras on this release, but at least we have a rather nice Blu-ray presentation of this really undervalued Arthurian adventure classic. Next is a truly fantastic film that unfortunately does not get talked about in the way that it should, and doesn't really have a proper version available. It does have some various rights issues, and there is not a beautifully restored Blu-ray or 4K version available as there should be. This is unfortunately the fate of several of the great roadshow epic films produced by Samuel Bronston, others being like the great Fall of the Roman Empire. But I had to talk about 1961's El Cid, directed by the legend Anthony Mann. This is one of the most impressive historical roadshow epics you can ever see, with an absolutely breathtaking Miklos Rozsa score, which is one of the great film scores by one of the great composers. This is the Miramax restoration done in the 1990s here on the Criterion Laserdisc, which is unfortunately still a pretty solid way of seeing the film since it is so unavailable. Miramax backed a DVD version in the mid-2000s, and there are some various Blu-ray versions floating around in overseas markets based on similar masters that don't look very good, and this is one of those grand films that truly needs resurrection on home video, because unfortunately you have to go back to releases like this, and it does not give you the full width and breadth of the visual splendor that is El Cid. This is an incredibly handsomely mounted production about the legendary Spanish historical figure, here played by Charlton Heston. It's an incredibly impactful film in both its visuals and its incredible score. Again, this is one of the most handsomely mounted of all of the grand roadshow epics produced in the 1950s and 60s. It is just an incredible film to behold if you've never seen it before, and it's such a shame that it is harder to get a hold of, because once you finally see it, you're just completely bowled over by the absolute splendor of Elseed. There's the lovely Criterion gatefold. So unfortunately, this is still one of the easiest and best methods to see this grand film. It does have a fantastic sound presentation with a 5.1 iteration of the soundtrack as well, but I am hoping that this does get a proper 4K or better restoration at some point, because it practically cries out for it. But if you are looking for a grand roadshow epic that will really give you production design that is out of this world and more than worth your money, Elseed is a fantastic example. Although this is giving you much more, obviously, since it is dealing with a Spanish character and a part of Spanish history. Obviously, it's going to be very much based around Spanish armaments and armor in terms of what is on display. But it is still an incredible film to look at for getting this part of history in terms of production design and costume design in films. Plus, anytime you have an excuse to once again look at one of the truly great historical roadshow epic films, then that's no excuse at all. And it's an incredible film to come back to. That's one I do highly recommend, because it is so little seen and little talked about. And again, it's such a shame that both this and Fall of the Roman Empire are sort of stuck in a video no man's land. So hopefully that can get addressed at some point. But until then, even though this is still a difficult film to get a hold of and doesn't exist in the best video transfers, do not let that deter you. This is a visual and oral feast for every audience, and incredibly well directed by the is a legend and should be recognized as a legend and is not properly recognized Anthony Mann, one of the great motion picture directors. Next is the other film on this list that is definitely in the horror category, and it is a film with sumptuous visuals, costumes, sets, and production design, which very much does not fit with who made the film. It is known for being the most visually sumptuous of this particular series of films, from a director and producer very well known for pretty much usually doing the opposite of everything I just said. But it is an incredible film for its visuals, and in spite of its meager budget, it has some really extremely well done sets, costumes, and of course visible armor and armament on display. That, of course, is the 1964 just incredible, indelible film that Roger Corman made, The Masque of the Red Death, the penultimate of his iconic Edgar Allan Poe series made for American International Pictures, and both it and the final film, The Tomb of Ligeia, were both produced in England. And of course, since Roger Corman was famous for using whatever he get his hands on, reusing footage, or in this case, reusing sets, this primarily is actually reusing sets from other British films that had been made, but most of all is reusing elements and sets from the classic film Beckett, which I did think about including on this list, but since I was already going to talk about Red Death, which actually reuses some of the same sets, I figured it sort of counted in that way as well. So Corman, of course, it was and is a master of being able to turn things into gold in that way. But Masque of the Red Death really does leave an indelible impression with its visuals alone. It is in beautifully photographed color and widescreen in full scope, as are all of the Corman Poe films. And this was shot by the great Nicholas Roeg when he was still in his cinematographer days, before he became known as the famous film director later on. So it has production values far beyond its meager budget, and has such creativity on display, and really does transform Poe's original short story, which itself is extraordinarily short, into a real vivid and fully fleshed out work, here in this case by mixing in some elements of some other Poe tales. So just like the other Corman Poe films, they show an incredible means of transforming such a short Poe story into a fully fledged feature of its own. Masque of the Red Death is the most visually striking of all of the Poe films, and definitely is the one that feels the most lavish. Both the final two films in the series, this and Tomb of Ligeia, because they were shot in the UK and had slightly larger budgets, they do feel the most lavish of all the Corman Poe films. And the horror elements are definitely there, and all of this is capped off by one of Vincent Price's greatest performances in any film. It is a must-see simply for Price at his most delicious and deliciously evil as Prince Prospero from Poe's original tale. So it is a visual feast for the eyes. It's a fantastic experience. It is an iconic film of the 60s. This is the original spiffed up widescreen double feature Laserdisc release. This was the first truly decent version of the film you could get on home video. Previous versions were all pan and scan, and seeing this widescreen classic pan and scanned is an absolute crime, really. It just totally is a travesty and a waste. This film was designed and intended for scope viewing. But what was important about this release is it was actually fully uncut. The film did have a number of censorship trims and troubles back in the day in both the US and the UK, and a lot of video releases are missing certain bits of sequences and certain shots. So usually most versions are missing anywhere between a minute and 2 or 3 minutes of footage. So this Laserdisc for the longest time was the only way you could get the complete film. Studio Canal did recently restore the film in 4K for Blu-ray release. It is available and finally uncut again in the Blu-ray reissue here in the US from Shout Factory, and then Studio Canal released it themselves in the UK on Blu-ray. So there is a nice new restored version to look at that is uncut. But of course, I had to show the Laserdisc because it does have some form of the iconic original one-sheet poster art with the amazing art of Vincent Price with the blood red face with all of the various partygoers imprinted on his face. It is one of the great one-sheet poster images of the entirety of the 1960s. And Masque of the Red Death is one of those films when you see, especially as a young child and already as a Poe fanatic like I was, it's a film you never forget, which is also the same for the entirety of Corman's Poe cycle for AIP. But it is a wonderful film to look at for its production design, and of course all the more amusing because most of the stuff were of course hand-me-downs from Beckett and other films, so you can sort of play spot and recognize the sets and props and costumes, but the staging is immaculate, and it is again its own completely unique visual experience. Next is a really underrated film that I wish was more talked about, because this is really, of course I don't claim to have seen every film of this genre, but if I had to choose what I thought was the most realistically done film to really do the historical time period justice in all of the proper period detail, I would be hard-pressed to find a more historically accurate film than 1965's The Warlord with Charlton Heston, directed by the great Franklin Schaffner. It's set in the 11th century, and again, the historical period accuracy, particularly for a 1960s film and from Universal at that, is really astounding. That is what really sells this film, along with the excellent direction. Again, is the sense of period accuracy, and that they went to pretty elaborate lengths for the time to really sell the 11th century in a period setting. So again, this is pretty much the most realistic film from the Hollywood studio system era that I am really aware of in terms of trying to do the Middle Ages and medieval times. So again, it is incredibly well realized in its production design, and it just never really grabbed the recognition that it should have had in terms of historical films. It didn't really have a lot of good video releases, so this is the nice old Universal Letterbox Laserdisc. It has finally gotten a Blu-ray release. Kino Lorber has done a release here in the U.S., and then Eureka did a release in the U.K. They use the same old master from Universal, so it's not like they're a fancy new scan, unfortunately, but they do have some extras, so at least the film is out there with some actual extras and in HD and looking pretty decent, but it still could use a new scan. But it's one of those films that I do like to represent where possible in terms of talking about historical films, because again, for period accuracy, it is just about the most accurate that I am aware of, and it's one of those that I wish more people would see when they're looking for this genre of films. And since it is so little known, every time I put together a list of historical or medieval films, almost always one of the first films that comes to mind is 1965's The Warlord. Next, and of course you knew it was coming, is 1975's Monty Python and the Holy Grail, a film that needs no introduction, but what truly makes it special is just how amazingly well the Python troupe, with their absolutely pitifully tiny, minuscule budget and lack of production values, managed to get across the misery of living in this time period. The fact that everyone is covered in dirt constantly and everything is grimy and nasty looking. It will, of course, is because they literally had an extraordinarily low budget, but it's also ridiculously historically accurate. So, ironically, Holy Grail, while constantly riffing on and making fun of the way that Hollywood had treated medieval times and Arthurian legend, is actually doing an amazingly accurate rendition of the misery of living in medieval times. And that just helps to enhance the film's never-ending allure. And it's just another one of the many reasons why Holy Grail is an iconic work, and a work that should be properly respected as art, not just as one of the most hysterically funny films ever made. And again, part of what makes it so hysterical is knowing the films they're making fun of, right down to the hilarity of how the iconic Black Knight fight scene goes, and how it is totally making fun of and pulling directly from 1953's Knights of the Round Table. So this stuff goes full circle. This is the lovely old Criterion Laserdisc release. This is still my favorite version. It's got the lovely custom packaging, and the liner notes are in full Python style, and there's also lovely in-jokes in the chapter listings and things, just like the iconic in-jokes in the opening subtitles, which of course are just some of the best opening titles of all time. But it is a film that I find personally that a lot of times people get wound up in the jokes, and they don't necessarily always look at the film as art, which it is, and looking at how miserable it was to make and how difficult it was to make just makes you appreciate the film all the more, and the team's perseverance in actually finishing the film. Now, currently the best release is Sony's anniversary reissue from 2015 for the 40th anniversary. This maintains the all-important original mono track. It is bumped up to a lossless codec, and the film's original 1.66 to 1 British ratio is fully maintained here. That doesn't always happen, but thankfully Sony's always been pretty good about that with their modern Holy Grail releases. This has the nice slipcover, the custom art, and then the disc inside. The art is, of course, the giveaway about this being the reissue. This does add an extra or two over the previous Blu-ray, and it has the previous Blu-ray's nice extras package. So this will get you the most amount of special features about the making of the film, plus the wonderful commentaries. but also looking at these the restoration work Sony has done with this film, it looks incredible for its low budget origins and all the way we grew up seeing it over the years. So it was amazing getting it in widescreen in the Laserdisc era to begin with, and then once the DVD started coming out, and then getting to the Blu-ray and Sony's HD transfer and restoration, it's absolutely incredible that this film looks as good as it does. I mean, it just enhances the griminess and the production design, and the low budget aesthetics help to really and truly sell that misery of being in medieval times feeling the film has always had. It's just a lovely Blu-ray, and there are rumors floating around that the Python films are being worked on in 4K, so there might be a UHD release of not just the Holy Grail, but also the masterpiece Life of Brian and Meaning of Life in 4K UHD, which would be nice to see. Meaning of Life would probably take a little longer, seeing as that's Universal, but definitely Holy Grail and Life of Brian are supposedly going to be having a 4K UHD release at some point. But until then, this 40th anniversary Blu-ray reissue with the lossless mono is still the best current release available. But I would be remiss if I didn't still say that my favorite version is the Criterion Laserdisc, which still has really lovely audio and a lovely commentary and some nice little exclusive extras as well. So that's why I still have both of them. And then in a film that is very much Python related, seeing as it has so many of the troupe in it and is very much tied to Holy Grail, that it's difficult to not think about them both sort of grouped in together. This is a truly underrated classic. As 1977's Jabberwocky, directed by Terry Gilliam. This was his first directorial effort, starring Michael Palin and Terry Jones and other Python affiliates in terms of the cast and crew. This is very much a spiritual successor to The Holy Grail, with an even more acerbic, dark humor. It is basically taking the idea of Lewis Carroll's classic Jabberwocky poem, which is inside Alice in Wonderland and the original tales of Through the Looking Glass, and transposing it into medieval times once again, and taking the production design ideas in Holy Grail and having an actual feature budget put behind them, but with the wild, wacky, and acerbic dark humor of Terry Gilliam on full blast for the first time. In some ways, I like this just as much as Holy Grail, and I do think this is an outstanding classic with a wonderful Michael Palin lead performance. It is a beautifully funny, hysterical, dark comedy with, again, some incredible production design values that make you realize it was miserable to live in medieval times, but everything is done with a really gloriously funny and morbidly dark sense of humor. It's a film I don't like to spoil. I like to show it to people and have them go in cold if they've never seen it before, because unfortunately it is much more obscure. This is the Sony DVD. It really had crummy video releases before this. This was at least finally getting it in widescreen. It did finally get a restoration, and Criterion has done a Blu-ray. I just haven't picked it up yet, with some nice new extras and some Terry Gilliam input as well. This actually does have a Gilliam commentary with Michael Palin, which is a fun listen. But again, if you are a Python fan, or if you love Holy Grail and you have never seen Jabberwocky, it will basically feel like something you already should have known, because it just feels like a natural growth from Holy Grail. If I did have to pick my favorite Terry Gilliam picture, it would probably be between this and Time Bandits. I love both of them. I love Brazil as well, of course, but this one holds a very special place in my heart, because it's got one foot in Holy Grail territory and the other foot completely in Terry Gilliam land. And if that hasn't sold you, then I don't know if this is the film for you. But it is a blisteringly funny and incredibly well realized tale that just absolutely has a production design that does outdo Holy Grail. And of course, it helped that they had a legitimate budget actually behind it this time. So this is basically, if you want to call it Holy Grail 2 or Holy Grail 1.5, that's a very good descriptor for coming to Jabberwocky for the first time. Next is really a sort of reinvention of Arthurian legend in films and trying to come at it from a different approach. And that is the 1981 John Boorman directed Excalibur. This is the lovely old Warner Brothers widescreen Laserdisc presentation. This does completely give you a fresh look and approach to this type of film in terms of its visual style, its photography, its usage of color and lighting especially, and there is a great focus on the armor because of the way the lighting is done. The armor and costuming of this film definitely leave an indelible impression in the mind when you see this for the first time. Again, this is the Warner Brothers Laserdisc. There is a DVD and a decent Blu-ray, but this is a film that really does need a new scan and definitely could be a nice special edition since this is a bit of a cult film. It definitely has a devoted fan base. It was sort of it had a split reaction with critics and audiences when it came out, but it did achieve enough success and is sort of the next sort of stepping stone in how medieval films and films about knights and Arthurian legend and Holy Grail quests and all sorts of medieval films sort of branch off from this point in 1981, where after Excalibur, it sort of changes the approach that was made. And then to round out this list, the final film I wanted to talk about is a very special one for me, and obviously the most modern, so this one is actually from this century, but I wanted to talk about a film that I feel is very undervalued, and unfortunately that is partially due to the fact that it was given an extraordinarily compromised release version that was drastically cut down by 20th Century Fox. So that is the 2005 Ridley Scott directed Kingdom of Heaven, which you should only see in its original version, which is termed the director's cut, which clocks in at 194 minutes. This is a full-on, through and through, historical, epic film, the way that they used to be made. It is building off of the success, obviously, that Scott had previously on Gladiator in 2000, but this is a far more complex and richly textured film and is actually taking place during the Crusades and is trying to at least tell a more historically accurate and balanced presentation of the actual nature of the Crusades and how it affected both sides of the conflict. So it is, again, incredibly well mounted, and even though it is using CG technology and digital effects as films would in 2005, it does have still a heavy reliance on practical effects. So the costuming and armor in this film is truly fantastic. The whole world of the film comes alive from its very opening and stays that way through its entire 3-hour plus runtime. This is the original sort of bare bones Blu-ray release, which is actually giving you the full-length version, but doesn't have all of the wealth of extras that were created for the original 4-disc DVD release, which premiered the full-length version of the film. So this is still the most deluxe packaging, but this was basically ported over to the Blu-ray release. So this has one of those really nice DVD era digipack fold-out designs, and then there is a hinge tray for the 4-disc plus a nice booklet as well. The DVD also went the extra effort of actually creating a proper overture, intermission, and exit music, properly replicating the classic roadshow event film type experience that was how you saw historical epics in the 1960s. That was not carried over to the first Blu-ray, but how finally in 2014 Fox did a new issue that gave us this Ultimate Edition, this 2-disc Blu-ray release, which is still very inexpensive. This actually gives you not just the long version of the film, it also gives you the option to watch it with the overture and roadshow presentation, but it also gives you the drastically inferior theatrical cut for those who still prefer the studio edit of the film that runs about 140 minutes. So that is all seamlessly branched on disc 1, and then all of the extremely impressive extras from the DVD release are on the rest of the disc and on disc 2. So everything has finally been condensed into a single release. So here it is. It's just a standard 2-disc set, but at least everything is now in one place. Again, I do think this is the finest modern historical epic that there is. I think it is truly impressive and is easily my favorite modern Ridley Scott film. He has occasionally gone back to films like this with other films, like one I actually really enjoyed. That was 2010's Robin Hood, and then he later did the historical retelling of the Ten Commandments in Exodus, Gods and Kings. So he occasionally comes back to this sort of historical film well, but I don't think it has ever been quite as impressive and well done as the proper full-length version of 2005's Kingdom of Heaven, which again I think is the finest modern historical film there is. So that is my little program of medieval and Arthurian films, and films expressly focusing on great production design and especially getting across the amazing craftsmanship that went into all of the grand arms and armament and armor that we naturally associate with knights in armor. So again, this goes hand in hand with the new Frist exhibition. Will run through October, featuring pieces from the Museo Stibert in Italy. It is a really nice show, and again, seeing pieces like that just automatically make my brain fire off with all of the various films that it makes me think of. And I did try to focus on films where the armor was a key component or part of the already impressive and amazing production design, and again, trying to also focus entirely on films within the correct historical periods of the pieces you will see in this exhibit, with some outliers as well that do have really impressive armor in terms of the costuming. So I hope this has been fun and informative. I really enjoy putting together things like this simply because this is how my brain works anyway whenever I see something. And I do find it a fun challenge and a very rewarding one to come up with additional film programs for museum exhibits. And with knights and the entire medieval period, it's a perfect idea to put together a film series, since there are just countless films dealing with knights and Arthurian legend and just so many different examples you can go with. It becomes then the challenge to reduce it down to key films like I've talked about here, where the period detail and the historical world they are recreating for the story being told is such an important component, and I tried to focus on the ones where I feel it is done extremely well or done really the best, and are shining examples of how these types of films absolutely should and must be made in order to achieve any sense of historical accuracy or verisimilitude with the stories being told. So, as always, I hope this has been fun and informative, and thank you ever so much for watching.